Chapter 2, The Meaning of Consciousness. Being and knowing are identical because if a thing does not exist, no one knows it. But whatever has most being is most known. Meister Eckhart. The goal of psychotherapy, indeed of all modes of psychological development, is the maximum degree of consciousness. Consciousness, and all it signifies, is the ultimate value. But what does it signify? Do we really know what we mean when we use the word? A dictionary of philosophy gives the following definition. Consciousness. A designation applied to conscious mind as opposed to supposedly unconscious or subconscious mind, and to the whole domain of the physical and non-material. Consciousness is generally considered an indefinable term, or rather a term definable only by direct introspection appeal to conscious experience. The indefinability of consciousness is expressed by Sir William Hamilton. Consciousness cannot be defined. We may be ourselves fully aware what consciousness is, but we cannot without confusion convey to others a definition of what we ourselves clearly apprehend. The reason is plain. Consciousness lies at the root of all knowledge. The description tells us no more than that consciousness cannot be defined. In Psychological Types, Jung says, "By consciousness I understand the relation of psychic contents to the ego, insofar as this relation is perceived as such by the ego. Relations to the ego that are not perceived as such are unconscious. Consciousness is the function or activity which maintains the relation of psychic contents to the ego. Consciousness is not identical with the psyche because the psyche represents the totality of all psychic contents, and these are not necessarily all directly connected with the ego, i.e. related to it in such a way that they take on the quality of consciousness." This statement offers at least a beginning for a phenomenological description of the experience of consciousness. It also states explicitly the important fact that the ego is the carrier of consciousness. We can proceed further by examining the unconscious side of the term consciousness, namely its etymology. Conscious derives from con or cum, meaning with or together, and sire, to know or to see. It has the same derivation as conscience. Thus, the root meaning of both consciousness and conscience is knowing with or seeing with an other. In contrast, the word science, which also derives from sire, means simple knowing, i.e. knowing without witness. So etymology indicates that the phenomena of consciousness and conscience are somehow related, and that the experience of consciousness is made up of two factors, knowing and witness. In other words, consciousness is the experience of knowing together with an other, that is, in a setting of two-ness. I shall now examine the implications of this statement. Knowing. One side of the phenomenon of consciousness is the act of knowing, ultimately as mysterious a mental function, as closely related to the term consciousness. A whole branch of philosophy, epistemology, is devoted just to the problems and limits of knowledge. My approach, however, is not philosophical but psychological and empirical, and by this method the experience of knowing can be at least descriptively elaborated. The psychological function of knowing or seeing requires first of all that undifferentiated, diffuse experience be split into a subject and an object, the knower and the known. This primordial division of original oneness corresponds to Erich Neumann's description of the separation of the world parents. The separation of Father Sky and Mother Earth, or light from darkness, is the original cosmogonic event marking the birth of consciousness as the ability to know. As Neumann says, this act of cognition, of conscious discrimination, sunders the world into opposites, for experience of the world is only possible through opposites. The ego separates from the pleroma. The subject of knowledge is separate from the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing thus becomes possible. The original cosmogonic process of separating subject from object must be repeated with each new increment of consciousness. Each time the ego falls into an unconscious content, it can become conscious of it only by an act of separation that allows the ego to see the emerging psychic content, and thus become disidentified from it. A symbol for this process of separating subject from object, the knower from the known, is the mirror. The mirror represents the psyche's ability to perceive objectively, to be removed from the deadly grip of raw primordial being. Schopenhauer describes it in these words. It is indeed wonderful to see how man, besides his life in the concrete, always lives a second life in the abstract. In the former, he is abandoned to all the storms of reality and to the influence of the present. He must struggle, suffer, and die like the animal. But his life in the abstract, as it stands before his rational consciousness, is the calm reflection of his life in the concrete and of the world in which he lives. Here in the sphere of calm deliberation, what previously possessed him completely and moved him intensely appears to him cold, colorless, and, for the moment, foreign and strange. He is a mere spectator and observer. In respect of this withdrawal into reflection, he is like an actor who has played his part in one scene and takes his place in the audience until he must appear again. In the audience, he quietly looks on at whatever may happen, even though it be the preparation for his own death in the play. But then he again goes on the stage and acts and suffers as he must. The ability to turn an unconscious complex which has one by the throat into an object of knowledge is an extremely important aspect for increasing consciousness. To extend Schopenhauer's analogy, it is as though one who was fighting for his life in the arena were magically transported to the position of spectator. Desperate reality becomes an image of contemplation, and the subject as knower is removed beyond harm. This idea appears in the apocryphal Acts of John. At the time of the crucifixion, John could not bear to witness Jesus' suffering and fled to the Mount of Olives. There Jesus appeared to him in a vision and explained the meaning of the crucifixion, i.e., enabled John to contemplate it as an objective image. Although the multitude thought Jesus the man was being crucified, John was instructed to see it symbolically. Now what those things are I signify unto thee, for I know that you will understand. Perceive thou therefore in me the praising of the word, the piercing of the word, the blood of the word, the wound of the word, the hanging up of the word, the suffering of the word, the nailing of the word, the death of the word, and so speak I, separating off the manhood. When he had spoken unto me these things and others which I know not how to say as he would have me, he was taken up, no one of the multitudes having beheld him. And when I went down, I laughed them all to scorn, holding fast this one thing in myself, that the Lord contrived all things symbolically and by dispensation toward men for their conversation and salvation. Earlier in chapter 95 of the Acts of John, Jesus had told his disciples, "A mirror am I to thee that perceive me." And in chapter 96 he says, "Behold thyself in me. Perceive what I do, for thine is this passion of the manhood which I am about to suffer." In this text, Jesus is instructing the disciples how to separate subject from object, how to perceive experience as a mirror that provides an image of meaning rather than as chaotic anguish. This corresponds to active imagination or meditative reflection, which can turn an oppressive mood into an object of knowledge by discovering the meaningful image embedded in the mood. Jung, describing his own decisive encounter with the unconscious, says, "To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured." The classic mythical example of the value of separating subject from object by the power of reflection is found in the myth of Perseus and Medusa. To look upon Medusa directly is to be turned into stone, i.e., she represents a psychic content that destroys the ego. She can be overcome only by viewing her through reflection in the mirror shield which Athena provides for Perseus. I consider Athena's mirror shield ultimately to symbolize the process of human culture itself, which redeems man from the destructive Medusan horror of raw being. Language, art, drama, and learning provide the Athena mirror for humanity, allowing the psyche to emerge and develop. What Shakespeare says about drama is true for all cultural forms. They hold the mirror up to nature. Schiller describes the function of art in the same way. The serious purpose of genuine art is not merely to translate the human being into a momentary dream of freedom, but actually to make him free. It accomplishes this by awakening a power within him, by using and developing this power to remove to a distance of objectivity the sensory world which otherwise only weighs us down as raw material and oppresses us as a blind force. And Nietzsche expresses a similar idea when he says that the truly serious task of art is to save the eye from gazing into the horrors of night and to deliver the subject by the healing balm of illusion from the spasms of the agitations of the will. Dreams and fantasy can serve the same mirror function. For example, a man in the early stages of analysis dreamed that he looked into a mirror and was amazed to see that his face was his father's face. This man was identified with his father and was living out his father's unhappy fate. The dream was a mirror enabling him to see that fact, to make his identification with his father an object of knowledge. Thus, the subject of knowledge, the ego, became separated from the object of knowledge, identification with the father, and the dreamer took his first step out of that identification and into greater consciousness. Being known. To be able to climb out of the misery of raw being into the status of a knowing object is a part of the meaning of consciousness, and at times can be a salvation. The experience of being the knowing subject, however, is only one half of the process of knowledge. The other half is the experience of being the known object. The ego as knower conquers the outer or inner other by relegating it to the status of known object. But this is not consciousness in the full sense of knowing with. It is only science or simply knowing. To achieve authentic consciousness, the ego must also go through the experience of being the object of knowledge, which the function of the knowing subject residing in the other. To some extent, the experience of being that known object takes place in the course of psychotherapy. The therapist often carries the projection of the knowing other, causing the patient to feel reduced to the status of a known object. However, this transference-induced condition is partial and temporary. It is also dangerous since the patient is liable to get caught in a personal dependence on the human being who knows him. Dependence on that therapist becomes a substitute for dependence on the inner knowing one, i.e. the self. In a letter written in 1915, Jung describes vividly the dangers to the patient of being known or understood by the analyst. Understanding is a fearfully binding power, at times a veritable murder of the soul as soon as it flattens out vitally important differences. The core of the individual is a mystery of life, which is snuffed out when it is grasped. The menacing and dangerous thing about analysis is that the individual is apparently understood. The devil eats his soul away, which naked and exposed, robbed of its protecting shell, was born like a child into the light. That is the dragon, the murderer, that always threatens the newborn divine child. He must be hidden once more from the understanding of humanity. As Jung indicates in other sections of the same letter, the therapist's understanding of the patient is a necessary cautery for neurotic aspects of the personality. However, it should not be applied to the healthy psyche. Thus, the full experience of being the known object of an other knowing subject is best not projected onto a person, but rather experienced as an encounter with the inner God image, the self. The archetypal image that carries the clearest symbolic expression of the ego's experience of being the known object is the image of the Eye of God. This image played a large role in Egyptian mythology, according to Rundle Clark. The Eye of the High God is the great goddess of the universe in her terrible aspect. Originally, it had been sent out into the primeval waters by God on an errand to bring back Shu and Tefnut to their father. Thus, the Eye is the daughter of the High God. When it returned, it found that it had been supplanted in the Great One's face by another, a surrogate eye, which we can interpret as the sun or moon. This was the primary cause for the wrath of the Eye and the great turning point in the development of the universe, for the Eye can never be fully or permanently appeased. The High God turned it into a rearing cobra, which he bound around his forehead to ward off his enemies. In the dreams of a middle-aged woman, I have found an interesting parallel to the mythological equation of I equals snake. This patient was suffering from a chronic, painful physical illness and also was suffering psychologically in the effort to understand the meaning of her ordeal. She had this dream, reported in part. I am talking with friends. Something we talked about caused snakes to start crawling about the room. It was as though they had been inanimate objects on the wall that had been brought to life by something I said. I wanted to kill them, but a friend said I shouldn't. The next dream, a few days later, was this. I went to the kitchen sink to clean it up. It was actually just wet. As I looked at it, the drops of water separated. Each drop had a center in it like fish eggs or eyes. I did not throw them away. This woman tended to take the attitude of passive victim. These dreams occurred when she was starting to experience rebellious reactions against the victim role. The dream indicate that paying attention to the unconscious, talking about it, brought the snakes to life. Later the snakes turned into fish eggs or eyes. This movement is the reverse of the Egyptian myth in which the eye of God is turned into a rearing serpent. The idea would seem to be that the emerging instinctual reactions of protest of the snakes are actually autonomous centers of consciousness, fish's eyes, and hence are subjects to the ego's object. In other words, the dreamer was beginning to experience herself as the object of another subject. That other subject, the self, will not tolerate the meek passivity of the victim role, and by noting the reactions of inner protest, the woman discovered the objective subject within, i.e., the self. The image of fish's eyes comes up in alchemy as the oculi piscium, and it corresponds to the scintillae or multiple luminosities in the unconscious. Jung writes, "The fish's eyes are tiny soul sparks from which the shining figure of the phyllis is put together. They correspond to the particles of light imprisoned in the dark physis, whose reconstitution was one of the chief aims of Gnosticism and Manichaeism." The same image is discussed in his essay on the nature of the psyche, where again the multiple eye motif is equated with multiple luminosities. To be watched by strange, fishy eyes gives one the uncanny sense of other presences. The fish's eyes correspond to the multiple eye of God as described in Zechariah. These 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth. The major effect of such an experience is the realization that one is not alone in the psyche. In another Egyptian text, the eye of God says of itself, "I am the all-seeing eye of Horus, whose appearance strikes terror, lady of slaughter, mighty one of frightfulness." The experience of being a known object, being seen by the eye of God, can be a fearsome experience, because unconscious contents as a rule cannot stand to be observed. They react violently to being known because this destroys or relativizes the autonomy they enjoy while operating unconsciously. These unconscious contents or complexes are various aspects of ego self-identity, which is profoundly threatened by being subordinated to the status of an object known to a transcendental subject. Jung's first childhood dream contains the image of the eye and illustrates another aspect of its phenomenology. Between the ages of 3 and 4 he dreamed, "I discovered a dark rectangular stone-lined hole in the ground. I had never seen it before. I ran forward curiously and peered down into it. Then I saw a stone stairway leading down. Hesitantly and fearfully I descended. At the bottom was a doorway with a round arch, closed off by a green curtain. It was big, heavy curtain of worked stuff like brocade, and it looked very sumptuous. Curious to see what might be hidden behind, I pushed it aside. I saw before me in the dim light a rectangular chamber about 30 feet long. The ceiling was arched and of hewn stone. The floor was laid with flagstones, and in the center a red carpet ran from the entrance to a low platform. On this platform stood a wonderfully rich golden throne. I am not certain, but perhaps a red cushion lay on the seat. It was a magnificent throne, a real king's throne in a fairy tale. Something was standing on it which I thought at first was a tree trunk 12 to 15 feet high and about 1.5 to 2 feet thick. It was a huge thing, reaching almost to the ceiling, but it was of a curious composition. It was made of skin and naked flesh, and on top there was something like a rounded head with no face and no hair. On the very top of the head was a single eye, gazing motionlessly upward. It was fairly light in the room, although there was no windows and no apparent source of light. Above the head, however, was an aura of brightness. The thing did not move, yet I had the feeling that it might at any moment crawl off the throne like a worm and creep toward me. I was paralyzed with terror. At that moment I heard from outside and above me my mother's voice. She called out, "Yes, just look at him. That is the man-eater." That intensified my terror still more, and I awoke sweating and scared to death. The phallic eye in this dream certainly fits the description of the eye of Horus, whose appearance strikes terror. The fact that it is called the man-eater corresponds to Jung's remarks that understanding eats the soul away. The eye as phallus is analogous to the eye as snake, and would allude to the creative power of seeing and being seen. Similarly, in the Old Testament, to know is synonymous with to have intercourse with. The terror caused by the eye is due to its connection with the wrath of God. An ancient Egyptian myth of the destruction of mankind illustrates how the eye of God can function as the instrument of divine wrath. Ra, the god who created himself, was originally king over gods and men together, but mankind schemed against his sovereignty, for he began to grow old. When he realized that mankind was plotting against him, he said to his suite, "Go, summon me hither my eye, together with Shu, Tefnut, Jeb, and Nut, all the fathers and mothers who were with me in the primeval waters." So the gods were brought together, and they said, "Speak to us that we may hear." So Ra addressed Nun, personification of the primeval waters, "O eldest god, in whom I myself come into being, and you, O ancient gods, behold mankind, who come from my eye, have been scheming against me. Tell me what you would do about it." Then Nun said, "O Ra, my son, O God greater than he who made him and mightier than the who created him, O you that now sit upon your throne, if your eye were turned against those who are plotting against you, how greatly would they fear you?" Then the others who were about him said, "Let your eye be sent out to seize those who are plotting against you. Let it descend upon them as Hathor." So the goddess came and slew mankind in the desert. In this text, the eye of God is the agency of a last judgment. This theme is also a symbolic expression of the ego's experience of being an object of knowledge. In many religions, the judgment of the soul is projected into the afterlife and conceived as a post-mortem experience, in which the individual is finally subject to total scrutiny and is made the object of the comprehensive knowledge of God. Depending on the outcome of this trial, he will either be acquitted and sent to paradise or condemned and sentenced to hell. The image of the Last Judgment can be understood psychologically as a projection into the afterlife of the ego's encounter with the self and the archetypal experience of being the known object of a transpersonal subject. It is an awesome experience, as the myths make clear, an experience that man has understandably tried to postpone as long as possible by transferring it to the afterlife. The theme of being looked at or made the object of knowledge comes up often in dreams. For instance, a man dreamed that news cameras were set up to photograph him, but he was trying to avoid the cameras. Like a primitive, the dreamer was afraid of the eye of the camera. Sometimes during a major life crisis, the explicit image of the eye of God will appear in dreams. For instance, a young man who was going through a crucial transition leading to enlargement of consciousness had this apocalyptic dream. I was in a room or house that was made of adobe bricks, very earthen. The floor had a fine powder on it, like a residue from dry clay. The room was gray. Very little light seemed to be in the room, yet it was illuminated. I heard the pounding of the surf outside the room. This pounding became more and more intense on the walls as it grew louder and louder. The walls began to shake and rupture. Slit was in the air from the shrieking walls and covered me. Cracks and splits in the walls appeared. The room felt as if it were going to collapse on top of me. I felt I would be crushed by the bricks in the flood of water. The walls were buckling, the clay bricks loosening up and crumbling in. More and more they fell around me. My life seemed to flash through my mind. I had to get out. I could not perish here now. I was scared. I didn't know what was on the other side except I could hear the water crashing in on the walls. With all my strength, I reached far up over my head and ran toward the cracking wall. I hit and pushed the wall again and again. I stepped back and hit the wall. Behind me, everything was crumbling in. I was screaming. Rocks and water were all about me. Again I cracked the wall and pushed as hard as I could. The wall buckled and rippled. It split, cracked and groaned. Whole sheets of brick that were coming in on me, pushed outward by the force of my throwing my whole weight into the wall. The noise was thundering. Panic had gripped me. With another thrust, I felt as if all my strength would be drained. But yet again I hit the wall in what seemed like an even stronger thrust than before. The wall fell out before me. Everything behind me had silenced or was gone. I didn't know. Instinctively I looked up and saw a rounded eye that had blue sky and some white clouds in it. My perspective was one of reversed telescopic field. It seemed as if as I looked up at it, it looked down at me, as if I could see the eye that was looking up at it, and yet it felt to me something wholly other. I was in awe, and felt deeply humbled and inexplicably human. Another example is the dream of a middle-aged man who was going through an important psychological transition. He had developed physical symptoms which were ominously similar to those of an illness which had killed his father when he was only a few years older than the patient's present age. These symptoms threw the man into a state of acute anxiety, which was relieved in part only after thorough medical examinations proved that the symptoms had no organic basis. During his state of anxiety, he had this dream, reported in part. President Nixon was addressing a large group of people in the hall. I was sitting on a bench right next to his lectern. The thought crossed my mind. If I tried to kill him, no one could stop me. 2 guards in uniform came past me. One turned off all the house lights. A strange orange light came up at the back wall, where a large metal screen lifted, revealing some kind of scanning device. A loud hum became audible as the scanning device screened the hall with a mysterious ray. I saw a large eye through an opening in the back wall, looking in my direction and then roving over the hall. A shot rang out. A teenage boy who had evidently planned to kill the president had shot himself. When the lights were turned on again, President Nixon was kneeling in prayer. The chief image in this dream is the numinous eye of God. It is evident that the patient's fear of death has constellated the theme of divine judgment. The patient has a negative father complex with unconscious hostility towards father figures, indicated by the death thoughts directed towards President Nixon. The appearance of the eye of God has the effect of neutralizing this complex. The adolescent commits suicide. The manifestation of the self has dissolved an unconscious complex and left in its wake a religious attitude. President Nixon bending in prayer. Another middle-aged man, also experiencing an anxiety state, had this dream, reported in part. I am on a ship whose captain is an Ahab-like figure. I see a strange feminine being sitting on the railing of the ship. She touches her forehead with a wand, and at the touch a third eye appears. The captain, on seeing this miracle, rushes at the woman. He is overpowered effortlessly and led away. In his associations, the dreamer thought of the woman with the third eye as a kind of angel. Ahab represented ego inflation to him. The captain could tolerate no happenings on his ship outside his control. Concerning the captain being led away, he was reminded of a biblical passage referring to Christ. When he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto man. Interestingly, Jung has alluded to the same passage in his description of the ego's encounter with the self. When a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds and from the lesser the greater emerges, then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand what the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long-expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come, to lead captivity captive, that is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into the greater life, a moment of deadliest peril. The most striking image in the dream is the angel's third eye. This would correspond to the third eye of Shiva, which in Hindu mythology is said to have dangerous, destructive qualities. Concerning the 3 eyes of Shiva, Alan Denelu writes, the 3 eyes of Shiva represent the sun, the moon, and fire, the 3 sources of light that illuminate the earth, the sphere of space, and the sky. The Puranas and the Upanishads speak of him whose eyes are sun, moon, and life. Though his 3 eyes, Shiva can see the 3 forms of time, past, present, and future. The 3 eyes are said to shine like 3 suns. The frontal eye, the eye of fire, is the eye of higher perception. It looks mainly inward. When directed outward, it burns all that appears before it. It is from a glance of this third eye that Kama, the lord of lust, was burned to ashes, and that the gods and all created beings are destroyed at each of the periodical destructions of the universe. Shiva's third eye is similar to the Egyptian eye of God that can be an agency of destruction. In psychological terms, the eye will be destructive if all in the ego that is not appropriately related to the self. In other words, it will destroy inflated ego self-identity as represented by Ahab. According to Jacob Boehm, divine wisdom is the union wherein God eternally sees himself, he being that union himself. In the love, the light of God, the mirror is called the wisdom of God, but in the wrath it is called the all-seeing eye. If the archetypal image of the eye of God has been activated, it means that one is going through an ordeal analogous to that of Job. Jung states that Satan in the book of Job is presumably one of God's eyes which go to and fro in the earth and walk up and down in it. Satan has been represented as a being with many eyes. There is a tarot deck which pictures the devil as Argus with many eyes all over his body. The eye of God is thus usually experienced as that aspect of the self which is the adversary of the ego, hence the sense of ordeal which usually accompanies the experience. This description applies to all four individuals whose dreams I have presented. Knowing with. We have now explored the two sides of the knowing factor of consciousness. 1, the experience of being the knowing subject, and 2, the experience of being the known object. One could say that we begin our psychic existence in the unconscious state of known object and only laboriously, with the growth of the ego, achieve the relatively tranquil status of knowing subject. Then, if development is to proceed, the relative freedom we have won must be relinquished as the ego becomes aware that it is the object of a transpersonal subject, namely the self. After both these experiences, the way is open for the reconciling third, which I take to be the full meaning of knowing with. The process of knowing is a power process. To be a knower means to dominate the known object by the power of logos. To be the known one means to be the victim of the knower. To participate in the process of knowing means to play one of these two roles or both alternately. However, the definition of consciousness as knowing with has a second factor. It involves not only knowing but also withness. Withness is the dynamism of connectedness, the relationship principle. If knowing is a function of logos, withness is a function of eros. We thus reach the unexpected discovery that the word we use for the highest value, consciousness, is in its root meaning a conjunctio, a union of logos and eros. The experience of knowing with can be understood to mean the ability to participate in a knowing process simultaneously as subject and object, the knower and the known. This is only possible within a relationship to an object that can also be a subject. Practically, this means either a relationship with an outer other, a person, or an inner other, the self. In reality, both are required, although one's attitude type will determine the relative importance of outer and inner factors. The extrovert gives primary emphasis to the relationship with the outer expression of the self, and the introvert gives first value to the relationship with the inner manifestation of the self. The process of becoming conscious requires both seeing and being seen, knowing and being known. This is not hard to understand from the standpoint of the ego. But if there is to be true witness in our knowing, the same must apply to the other center of the process, namely the self. The self also must need to be known as well as to know. In fact, as already noted in Chapter 1, in answer to Job, Jung tells us specifically that this is the case. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though, from sheer unconsciousness, he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. Because Job has seen Yahweh's amoral nature, Yahweh is obliged to change. In psychological terms, because the self has been seen by the ego, the self's consciousness has been promoted. In this way, God or the self needs man. The pursuit of consciousness then does not allow one to rest in the attitude of being known and contained in God. The ego has a responsibility to the self to be its knowing subject as well as its known object. This idea of mutual knowing between the ego and the self is expressed theologically by Master Eckhart. It must be understood that this is all the same thing, knowing God and being known by God, and seeing God and being seen by God. We know God and see Him because He makes us know and see, even as the luminous air is not distinguishable from its luminant, for it is luminous with what illumines it. So do we know by being known, by His making us conscious. And again, God makes us to know Him, and His knowing is His being, and His making me know is the same as my knowing. So His knowing is mine, just as in the Master, what He teaches is the same as in the pupil, the thing that he is taught. And because his knowing is mind, and his knowing is his substance, and his nature and his essence, it follows that his substance and his nature and his essence are mine, and his substance, his nature, and his essence being mine, therefore I am the Son of God. Behold, brethren, what manner of love God hath bestowed upon us, that we should be the sons of God. In Ion, Jung collects examples, especially from Gnosticism, of the image of the ignorant or unconscious God, and of changes that occur in the God image in the course of cultural development. He then summarizes his conclusions. These utterances on the nature of the deity express transformations of the God image which run parallel with changes in human consciousness, though one would be at a loss to say which is the cause of the other. The God image is not something invented, it is an experience that comes upon man spontaneously. The unconscious God image can therefore alter the state of consciousness just as the latter can modify the God image once it has become conscious. This obviously has nothing to do with the prime truth, the unknown God, at least nothing that can be verified. Psychologically, however, the idea of God's agnosia, ignorance, or of the aninatos, theos, unconscious God, is of the utmost importance, because it identifies the deity with the numinosity of the unconscious. The reciprocal relations between the ego and the self, in which the self's knowing the ego promotes ego consciousness and the ego's knowing the self promotes self-consciousness, have interesting implications. Ordinarily, we think that suprapersonal powers and images are projections of our own mind. But if reciprocity exists, we equally may be projections of the transpersonal other. Two dreams of Jung's bring up this idea. In one dream which I had in October 1958, I caught sight from my house of two lens-shaped, metallically gleaming discs, which hurtled in a narrow arc over the house and down to the lake. They were two UFOs. Then another body came speeding through the air, a lens with metallic extension which led to a box, a magic lantern. At a distance of 60 or 70 yards it stood still in the air, pointing straight at me. I awoke with a feeling of astonishment. Still, half in the dream, the thought passed through my head. We always think that the UFOs are projections of ours. Now it turns out that we are their projections. I am projected through the magic lantern as C.G. Jung. But who manipulates the apparatus? I had dreamed once before of the problem of the self and the ego. In that earlier dream, I was on a hiking trip. I was walking along a little road through a hilly landscape. The sun was shining and I had a wide view in all directions. Then I came to a small wayside chapel. The door was ajar and I went in. To my surprise, there was no image of the Virgin on the altar and no crucifix either, but only a wonderful flower arrangement. But then I saw that on the floor in front of the altar, facing me, sat a yogi in lotus posture, in deep meditation. When I looked at him more closely, I realized that he had my face. I started in profound fright and awoke with the thought, so he is the one who is meditating me. He has a dream and I am it. I knew that when he awakened, I would no longer be. Since the unconscious provides the material of our dream life, the self becomes visible to the ego by being seen in dreams. Presumably, the reverse is also true. Perhaps the life dramas of the ego are the dreams of the self. Shakespeare says, we are such stuff as dreams are made on. Whose dreams? Perhaps our conscious lives are the symbolic dramas by means of which God becomes aware of himself. If all the world's a stage, who's the audience? Could God be watching the acting out of his complexes in the drama of human history? According to a Gnostic myth, the cosmos, including man, was created in order to collect and retrieve the scattered particles of light which had been lost in the beginning. Evidently, God needs the human ego to transmit consciousness to him. I offer you a personal fantasy. Suppose the universe consists of an omniscient mind containing total and absolute knowledge, but it is asleep. Slowly it stirs, stretches, and starts to awaken. It begins to ask questions. What am I? But no one answers. Then it thinks, I shall consult my fantasy. I shall do active imagination. With that, galaxies and solar systems springs into being. The fantasy focuses on Earth. It becomes autonomous and life appears. Now the divine mind wants to dialogue, and man emerges to answer that need. The deity is straining for self-knowledge, and the noblest representatives of mankind have the burden of that divine urgency imposed upon them. Many are broken by the weight. A few survive and incorporate the fruits of their divine encounter in mighty works of religion and art and human knowledge. These then generate new ages and civilizations in the history of mankind. Slowly, as the process unfolds, God begins to learn who he is. Near the end of his life, as noted in Chapter 1, Jung made a statement that expresses explicitly his conclusion regarding the general purpose and meaning of human life. It is worth repeating here. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Neither should he persist in his unconsciousness nor remain identical with his unconscious elements in his being, thus evading his destiny, which is to create more and more consciousness. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. It may even be assumed that just as the unconscious affects us, so the increase in our consciousness affects the unconscious. This passage distills the work of a lifetime, a life which in my opinion is the most conscious life ever lived. If we condense the statement to its essence, we arrive at this: the purpose of human life is the creation of consciousness. I find it profoundly significant and very moving that Jung should choose to leave us such an unequivocal answer to the universal question of the meaning of life. Jung, the man who always used such care not to go beyond the demonstrable empirical facts, the man who required knowledge rather than belief, has decided to answer the riddle of the Sphinx. We can be sure he knows the answer and is not just guessing. On the collective level, consciousness is the name for a new supreme value coming to birth in modern man. The pursuit of consciousness, conscience, unites the goal of two previous stages of Western history, namely religion and science. Religion, meaning linking back, has as its essential purpose the maintaining of man's connectedness with God. This corresponds to eros, the connecting principle, and the withness factor of consciousness as knowing with. Science, on the other hand, boldly gave up the connection with the other and opted instead to pursue an increase in human knowledge. If religion is self-oriented, science is ego-oriented. Religion is based on eros, science on logos. The age now dawning will provide a synthesis for this thesis and antithesis. Religion sought linkage, science sought knowledge. The new worldview will seek linked knowledge. It is already widely recognized that the pursuit of scientific knowledge as the highest goal of human endeavor is puerile and inadequate to the needs of the whole man. A return to the intellectually naive standpoint of concrete religious faith is equally inappropriate to the modern mind. A genuinely new goal and purpose for human existence is required. That new goal has been found and articulated by Jung. In his words, man is the mirror which God holds up before him, or the sense organ with which he apprehends his being. Thus, the individual striving for consciousness becomes the modern formulation of the venerable idea of laboring in the vineyard of the Lord, and a new answer to the age-old question of the meaning of life.